There you go.
Right, let's go back to your slides. No, you can't.
Yeah, we see him. So if you
But it's
just
not
do
the
slide,
power. You can, okay, let's put it in slideshow.
yep, that
Okay,
should do it.
is that good?
I think so. Yeah, I can see it. Can
Okay.
everybody else see the slides?
All right. Okay. Without further ado, then, I'm delighted to welcome to this um, meeting of TFun. Delighted to invite Dr. Alison Cook-Sather, who's all the way from United States. So she's just woken up and on her second cup of tea, and she's going to tell us a bit about her teaching journey or as her career journey as a teaching focused academic. And you're going to talk to us a bit about your kind of career pathway and some of the significant parts of that. And then really it's more of a we're happy to have sort of a conversation about it, and there's an
Right.
opportunity to ask lots of questions along the way. So um, this is designed to be quite an interactive session. So if you have questions along the way, please just chip in, and we'll try and make this more conversational. I've got lots of questions up my sleeve as well for you. So um, yeah, so I'll hand over to you. Thank you so much for joining us, Alison.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was actually kind of fun to look back at my journey, which is now about 30 years along at my current institution. But I'm actually going to start, I'll start at the very, very beginning of that. So, as Louise said, I definitely want it to be a conversation, but I thought it would be helpful for you to have just some touch points, with moments that I found important and sort of commitments that I made along the way that helped me to be my own guide, because I had a kind of a strange, not well mentored trajectory, which turned out fine, but it definitely wasn't typical. So we can move to the second slide, and you're welcome to keep these slides. I mean, anybody can have them who wants. So here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about prior to my taking my current job, completing my master's and teaching in high school in the late 1980s, then completing my PhD in reading, writing, and literacy, and taking a kind of unexpected job directing a secondary teacher certification program, then moving into directing and developing that education program for about a decade, and then expanding from that to creating a teaching and learning institute, which supports other people in reflecting on their teaching at my institution. And all along there, I taught undergraduate education courses and wrote about and published on what inspired me. And that is a key theme that I want to emphasize, is doing what is within the parameters, whatever parameters within which you're working, doing what is exciting and sort of just gives you energy, in your work. So that's kind of my underlying message. So why don't we go to the next slide, and I can talk about the first phase of my professional life. So I started out in secondary teaching as an English teacher in schools in the western part of the United States. So I had planned ever since I was in my second year of secondary school to be a teacher. I knew that's what I wanted to do, inspired in part by a fabulous teacher that I had. And so I always had that vision of myself. And I completed a master's and certification program at Stanford University right after completing my undergraduate degree, which was at University of California at Santa Cruz back in the fabulous days before they had grades. There were no grades, all just narrative evaluations. And so I completed that degree and then spent 5 years teaching in secondary schools on the West Coast in California. And that's where I developed many of my commitments to really working in partnership with students. I mean, obviously, I was the instructor of record at these schools, but I really tried as much as I could to listen to student voices, to integrate their perspectives into my planning, to revise what we were doing in response to their feedback. So that was a theme for me and a commitment for me from very, very early on in my professional life. Any questions just about that first moment? I can pause on each slide. You may not have questions yet, but I want to make space while the relevant slide is up in case you do.
I'm going to ask something. You said slipped in something interesting about the days where they had no grades. So I'd
Yeah.
love to hear either now or later what you think about this debate about whether we should be grading students or giving them just narrative feedback.
Well, I loved it, and it didn't impede my progress at all. I went from undergraduate to Stanford University to University of Pennsylvania to, getting a great job. So it certainly didn't impede my trajectory through higher education. And it really made the focus on the work, not on the grades, right? So there was a lot of discussion, of course, of how everyone was doing, but there was never a focus on numbers or grades or that kind of performance. There was much more focus on the engagement and on the learning. So I recognize, that that's one case for some of the social sciences. I know that in STEM, it's much more difficult, that there are expectations about grade point averages and certain kinds of qualifications for graduate school. But I think it's worth continuing that conversation. I'm not sure grades tell us that much really about what it matters, that people are doing. So that's my perspective on grading. I'd love to get rid of grading at my own institutions, but that doesn't seem to be happening at
Yeah.
this point. But yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Go on, Liam, you want to say something? Oh, you're on mute
You're
still.
muted
Hang
though.
on.
Unmute.
Ah,
Sorry,
okay.
I'm used to working in Teams. Zoom is
Yeah,
it's
it's
still
different.
rusty back there. Only if you guys have finished talking about the point you were.
Yeah, yeah.
I've
Yeah,
just got a
go for it.
question. Yeah, yeah. So one was an observation because I came out of my undergraduate psychology degree wanting to do education, and I think
Hmm.
we might be heading there in another slide or two. But it's
Yes.
this question of these sliding doors moments in careers. I often think of these with students about I mean, you mentioned from high school kind of deciding you wanted to follow this path.
Yeah.
um, I think in undergraduate psychology, my experience of working with students is because psychology can lead to so many different paths as well.
Hmm.
There's that kind of quite interesting challenge of students finding themselves in the degree,
Yes.
deciding
Yes.
where they're going to sit, what they want to pursue, and sometimes coming in with certain ideas and going somewhere else. So I wondered kind of from your perspective how as I said, we'll maybe get to this, but how does a career change or a move come about, and how do you think that shaped you as an academic? And also, how does that how do we do this well for our students? Because there's
Yeah.
lots of students who come in
Oh,
and they
yeah.
go out being immensely successful, but not in ways that they anticipated they would be. And some
That's right.
students, that's a real challenge for them to kind
Yes.
of recalibrate
Yeah.
and think about.
It's a great question. Yeah. I mean, and this is something I talk about with students all the time. And I will say that I knew that I wanted to teach, but as I sort of talk about in the coming slides, what I teach and in what role really changed and surprised me. I was not expecting, and I'll say more about that as we get to it. But to the basic question that you're asking, I think, is so important because we have a lot of students coming in to my institutions currently who, their parents want them to do this, or they think they have to do that, or whatever it is that they have in their minds. Oh, I've got to get a degree in economics, so I get a good job. But they don't want to do that. That's not what's interesting to them. And so I think our job is, within our roles, and not to say, that their parents don't have any role, which of course they do, is to help them find what they're passionate about, what they feel like this is what I really care about. This is what excites me. This is what I'm going to be able to do, in some form for the rest of my life. And that's what I mean about teaching, not the particular context or what exactly I might be teaching, but that experience of teaching and learning for me. For me, it's always reciprocal. So what I think is very important for us to do is to acknowledge the various forces, I guess I would say, or influences on students in terms of what has helped them shape their imaginations, in terms of their career possibilities, because that's really all it can be. They don't know what any of these things are going to actually be, nor do we, at this point in the way the world is shifting so much. So nobody knows what the future is going to look like. And so whatever it is that they have imagined, they need to or should do to sort of acknowledge that and what influenced that. And I often tell stories of more circuitous pathways that people have taken. And that varies by country. Some countries allow that. The United States does. I think the UK does more than some countries where you cannot take a circuitous path. You have to go very straight and decide very early, what that path is going to be, like France, for instance. But I think those of us in countries that have more options along the way, I think it's really important to talk with students about, yes, you have ideas, and some of the most fulfilling and exciting things come from places you never would have expected. And I have that conversation with students all the time. And sometimes it's a huge relief to them. They're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I could do something different. I thought I had to do this. And other times it's a tougher sell, and some just say, yeah, I wish I could do that, but I can't because I have responsibilities along these lines. And so I'm going to go in this direction. So I don't think we can control it, but I think we can make space and provide support for students to do as much thinking as they can about what's informing them, just so it isn't automatic. So they're just not deferring to some prescribed path that they think is the right one, but that they really haven't had much time or opportunity or support in examining. So that's what I would say. Yeah, is that what you're thinking of?
Yeah, no. I like you say, I think it's almost a sense check. The further I get into my own life, the more I realize that circuitous paths are more the norm than the kind of the unexpected, and being aware of that when working with students, I think really helps.
And naming it explicitly, because I do think that still, even now, I mean, even though now circuitous paths are more typical than they used to be, I think still many students come in thinking straight line, is what they should be doing.
I'd be interested in other people on this call as well. Like I now teach in a school of education. I have done for about a couple of years, but my experience when I was in a school of psychology was very much this kind of high degrees of students want to follow the clinical psychology degree path purely. Maybe a few others, but that's the high percentage. And just on the basis of the masters and the doctoral programs that they can't all get a place, and you're going to be having a conversation with quite a high proportion of your students about, okay, this is not looking like an option for you, or this is not a good fit for where your skills lie based on how you're progressing. So yeah, like I say, maybe I'm alone in that, but I saw a few other people nodding on cameras just now. So
I know there's some people on this call who've had very varied career routes in terms of where we are now. Julie, I don't know if that applies to you, but Alice, I was thinking of you maybe. Alana, I think we don't want to speak for you, but as going from kind of pure sort of psychology teaching then into more kind of academic leadership type roles, and having slightly different pathways, which I myself have taken. I've gone from psychology, then teaching psychology, but in a different setting in social work, and then going down sort of being more in the sort of teaching and learning and leadership pathway, really, which wasn't where I set out planning to go, but it's where I went.
Yep. Did anybody else want to speak to that before I move on with my journey? I'd be interested in hearing folks.
I think there's we're left with a hangover from probably the 1960s and before, where we have a job for life.
Exactly.
What do you want to do when you grow up? I want to do a particular job, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to stay within a company. I'm going to progress up a ladder, and I'm going to work for the NHS, and I'll climb and climb and climb and climb, and then I'll get to the end and I'll retire and I'll get my gold clock, and that's the end of that. And I think it really does our students a disservice, because as you said in the chat, how can they know the reality of these different jobs that they think they want to do? They get sold a myth through the media, through TV, but also even through their reading. The focus of clinical psychology is obviously on diagnosis and therapy and support of people who are struggling, not on risk assessment and paperwork and administration and all the other things, and getting to build a relationship with a particular client is really tough.
Yep.
You know, all of those things, they can't see that.
Yeah.
And you know, so they don't know what it is that they're aiming for. And then they
Mhm.
get set up, almost set up to fail, because
That's
how
right.
are they ever going to get into that? And actually, the world of work is changing so much and
So fast.
evolving so much that there's so many different ways that they
Right.
can achieve their goals and their values
Right.
without necessarily tying themselves to a career. And
That's right.
actually, we all, I mean, I've been a pub landlady, I've delivered pizza, I've sold double glazing, you know, that there are very few jobs. I've been a security guard,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and I've been an academic, and I've been a neuroscientist and a biologist and a psychologist and an educationalist in a business school and all sorts of different things. And I just think actually it's the variety that for
Yeah.
me, you know,
Right.
keeps me moving.
Exactly.
And I think actually we need to have more honest conversations with students about what the reality of these different jobs are.
Exactly.
Like
That
these
is exactly
hands
what I mean, by what's your passion, what's exciting you, and that can take form in all the jobs you listed, probably have a through line, of what it is about those that really, sort of, or you had to do it for at a moment when you needed to do it. I mean, there's that too. Everything can't be, meeting your passion at the highest level. But I totally agree with what you're saying about really having those conversations constantly about, first of all, what do you want to do? What excites you, not in the abstract as some sort of already predefined job, but also more importantly, how do you manage the unknown and the unpredictable and the uncertain? I just have an article coming out about that, about how the pedagogical partnership work that I support, that I'll tell you about, it's the Students as Learners and Teachers program, that actually prepares students for what one student called unknowingness, right? What do you do when you don't know? Which is most of the time, in reality. I mean, you can become an expert and still, the real stuff is not about knowing. It's about what you do when you don't know. And I think that is a very exciting way to think about education, to both of your points, about preparing students for the reality. Yeah, let's go with the people with their hands up. Some people's whole names are
Yeah, I
in there and
see.
some
I think
aren't.
Alice was
Yeah.
first. Go on, Alice, then Alex, then Katya.
Alice, Alex, Katie.
Hi.
Thank you.
Uh,
I was,
sorry, I
Oh,
heard Alice. That sounds like a. I'll just mute myself again and let Alice talk.
Yeah, sorry, Alice, Alex, then Katya.
thank you. I was just going to add, since Louise prompted me, I think one thing that will be really interesting to know from Alison is how different it is in the States compared to in the UK, because we have such a linear approach to education, and your approach, my understanding of it at least, is that it is at least a bit broader and students can experiment a bit more and take different courses and don't have to make an immediate decision. Whereas most of our students will have chosen, if they're doing psychology, will have chosen psychology at 17 at best, maybe earlier. And in some careers like medicine, in effect, if they've not chosen it by 14, 15, they're unlikely to succeed.
right.
So they're really narrow pathways in some areas,
Mhm.
and trying to get students to understand that just because our education system has given them what is often quite a narrow pathway, actually what you then go on to do with it can be
Right.
very, very broad. There's also something about psychology. So I'm not a psychologist at all, but there's if I live anywhere, it's probably education. But
Mhm.
I think there's something about the policing of psychology as a discipline. I don't know how British this is, that the BPS has a real control, not just over the undergraduate degree, but over the professional practice. And I know it's not unusual for there to be professional regulation, but it is very, very tightly controlled, and more so than most other academic subjects. And that probably has an impact on you. Either are or are not a psychologist. You can't be a bit of one.
Right.
And so I wonder about, I don't know, other people on this call will have more to say about that, I imagine, but I wonder if that does something to how we then get students to think about themselves, because it's one
Yeah.
of the most popular undergraduate degrees in the UK.
Yeah, same
And
in the
yet
US. Yeah.
and the vast majority of students will not end up in a career in psychology.
Right.
And we probably need to be more honest with them, particularly
Right.
because there's then a huge social class impact to who does and doesn't get into those careers
That's right.
because of the postgrad study involved.
Yep.
I'll stop there.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alice. Alex.
Yeah, no, I just want to say, sort of some of these points resonated with me in my sort of personal discussions with students, and I find a lot of them can actually be quite anxious about just their mindset is like, as Julie said, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And actually, probably the best question should be just what do you want to do next? Which is
Yes.
a kind of less perhaps stressful question.
Yes.
And I've worked in a light bulb factory and things like that. I've had a diversity of jobs as well. And I think a lot of our students, maybe there's a widening participation component in the sense that, a lot of them are maybe paying their way through university with jobs that they don't view as prestigious. So maybe like working in Tesco or something like that. And I'm always emphasize that, these are really valuable experiences and there's transferable skills. And ultimately, we have people in our department who've had completely different lives. So we have a guy called Dr. Morris Waddle. He used to be an engineer. We have a gentleman called David Pitcher, who's used to be a big businessman in London, and he decided that he just wanted to pivot, and really just emphasizing that sort of. I think for me, psychology is a degree, kind of broadly speaking, you're understanding people and the sort of human condition, which I think's useful for most
Everything.
vocations in some capacity. So just emphasizing the transferable skills
Exactly.
is a big part of what we do.
Yeah.
In New York, certainly. But those are just my two thoughts. I also think just being upfront about the sort of maybe diversity in careers that faculty have had, I think could be, because they, unless I told them, they wouldn't know that I worked in a light bulb factory, or
Right.
that maybe all these people had different experiences, and you can have a very fulfilling career. If anything, it contributes to your uniqueness as an individual and what you bring to the table by sort of drawing on all these diverse experiences.
Yep. Yeah.
Thank you. And Katia, and then we'll move on, I think, after you, Katia.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, what I wanted to say is very much aligned with what Alice and Alex said. Yesterday, I was having lunch with a friend who is also a psychology lecturer, and we were talking about his 17-year-old. And I do, in my martial arts gym, I am surrounded by teenagers, and I was quite shocked after a few conversations with them that we do have some like self-reflection exercises that are very much encouraged in this environment, and everything that they can that they can reflect and that they can project is all about education and A levels, so they cannot see beyond that, and then maybe they can see as far as a university application or an apprenticeship application. And for me, that was quite sad that they could not think about their lives outside of that, because also it puts a lot of pressure on them in terms of the exams and what's going to happen. And they're all very stressed and anxious. We see them that in the university with the first years. At the same time, everything that we are talking about, like it doesn't have to be the choice for the rest of their lives. And I remember a few years ago, I was attending an event at the university that they put together people who work in the industry, some lecturers and some students. And the student who was on the same table that I was said that they only applied for the university because the other option was to get a job. And I was just like, but why are you getting yourself into a lot of debt, doing something that takes a lot of effort, a lot of energy? Yes, gladly they might learn something, maybe it will be helpful for them and they might change their mind, but I felt like, why did you rush to make such a decision? And yeah, I do wonder how can we talk to students, in which spaces can we have those conversations, because I felt whenever I tried to have this conversation, it just they felt it felt awkward for the students. It felt that it didn't have a place in the university as well, and I'm just like, well, if this is not a place, where are we having these conversations with them?
Right. Yeah, no, these are really, really great points and such important considerations for how we structure our invitations and our learning opportunities for students, right? I mean, it's easy for me in education to fold all of this in. It sounds like a lot of people here are in education in some form, but it has to be very intentional, I think, and very consistent, because of course they're worried about the A levels because that's how the system is set up to move them toward that as a very high stakes moment. So we have to provide, this is why I think we should not have grades, other spaces in which they can really be focusing on their learning, but the systems don't work that way. So yeah, these are ongoing questions for sure, but maybe Louise, we can move to the next slide and I can talk about sort of the first unexpected turn that my career took, which was that, I went and I did this PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. It was in reading, writing, and literacy. So I expected that I would take a job in some doctoral program somewhere in reading, writing, and literacy or something related to that. I was still on the fairly straight line path at that point. But instead, I got an offer to take the position directing a secondary teaching certification program at a small liberal arts college, undergraduate, right? So completely different from what I'd had in mind. I had thought I would be at the doctoral level. I thought I would focus narrowly on reading, writing, and literacy in some way. And instead, I took a job at a liberal arts college with an absolutely general focus on teacher preparation. Because our college is so small, we only have one methods course, one secondary teaching methods course for people getting certified across 12 disciplines. And then we work with subject area specialists in the area so they get subject area preparation, but within the context of a single secondary teaching methods course. So
Alison,
that was a big change in direction. What, Louise?
can I just interrupt you? Can you just explain the liberal arts college as opposed to what?
As opposed to a research university,
Okay.
or as opposed to a state university. We have a lot of different kinds of institutions of higher education in the United States. So they're sort of, if we had to have hierarchies, there'd be at the top the research we call R1, Research 1 universities, where the focus is really research, although instructors do some teaching. And then we also have state schools, which are have much lower tuition, and many students automatically are admitted to those state schools. Then we also have liberal arts colleges, which are small private institutions that really try to teach a liberal education. So there are a lot of breadth requirements. There's not a pre-professional focus. It's really on preparing in a more whole way is the idea. Whether that happens or not is another question. But there's certainly this wide range of institutions. And so Bryn Mawr College and Haverford College, where I work, are both small liberal arts colleges. So, and many institutions across everything that I just explained have teacher certification programs. So to teach at the secondary level in a public school, what you would call a private school, is you have to have a certification through the state. And so that's the program that I took a job directing before I had finished my PhD, which wasn't the smartest, but I did do that. And then before I'd finished my dissertation, I finished the dissertation and in the first few years while I was teaching in this program, small program, preparing people to teach at the secondary level. And this is when I started thinking we need to have some sort of structure within our teacher education programs at the university level, at the college level, that prepares our students to be teachers through putting them in dialogue with secondary students, right? Because in so many preparation to teach programs, it's all the classes are at the university. You do student teaching and you do some placements in schools, but you don't have any real dialogue with the people that you're preparing to teach. And so that's when I created this structure called Students as Learners and Teachers. And what that did was to pair, so every student, every college student who was enrolled in my secondary methods course was partnered with a student at a secondary school close by. And in the days when I started it back in the 90s, they wrote actual letters to one another, and I drove the letters back and forth, from the secondary school to the college and exchanged them. Shows how old I am, right? That we did this pre-email, sort of technology. And basically it was a dialogue between the secondary students and the college students preparing to be secondary teachers about everything, so it was about how do you create a welcoming classroom environment? How do you create equitable assessment? What kinds of assignments, are most engaging and effective for students? So it really helped the college students preparing to be teachers to understand how kids think, right? And to understand how they say things and what helps them, as learners. And so I created that program with a secondary teacher friend of mine, and back in 1995, and it still runs. I don't run it anymore because as I'll explain in a minute, I've moved on to other roles, but now of course they use, whatever. I can't even think of the kind of technology that they use, all those platforms that kids use these days, and it's much more immediate the communication they have is immediate through those platforms. But that was a moment that I wanted to share with you, both of an unexpected turn, right, where I took a job that I didn't anticipate, that I was preparing for, and a commitment, once I got into that job, of creating a structure within my support of people preparing to be teachers that would really help them understand and be in dialogue with, and be the kind of teacher that would stay in dialogue with students, when they became classroom teachers. So that was sort of the next phase. My first real professional, that was my first job. I mean, I'm one of the last people, these lifers, that what we were talking about before, who has basically stayed in the same institution where I took my first job. Very rare at this point. But that's what I did when I first got there. So maybe we can go to the next slide, which is linked with that, but also has a different shift, right? So as director of the Bryn Mawr Haverford Education Department, that Bryn Mawr College and Haverford College are the names of the two colleges where I work, and they have a consortial relationship. They're different institutions, but they work a lot in partnership. So I oversaw the certification program and developed minor tracks. So a minor track is, it's not a major, but it's a series of courses that you can take within education studies that leads either to certification or not. So they have many more choices now within our department of what kind of pathway they want to trace through the course offerings. So some are preparing to be secondary teachers, and we have a state certification program, but others are preparing to work in nonprofits or to work in out-of-school contexts or to become professors in higher education. So they want to take a collection of courses in education studies, but they aren't planning to get state certification to teach at the secondary level. So we've really diversified the tracks, and that's something that I led as director of the program, and something for everybody to think about, sort of what are the options that you can develop within an already structured program of study that gives students more choices and agency. And so my teaching focus shifted from literacy, right, broadly conceived, to secondary teaching methods. And I was not on what we call a tenure line. So we have tenure lines, which lead to permanent appointments. And then we have non-tenure lines that are more like year-to-year contracts. So at first I was on a year-to-year kind of contract, but then my position was converted to a permanent line, and publishing started to be expected, right? So I started out on a path that didn't expect publication, focused on teaching, and then the position itself changed. And so I actually had to apply for it. I had to apply for other positions. And that was very weird and not a great experience. But I did get this job and other offers, which was a good moment, because then I could bargain, a little bit about my own position. But so that was those were a couple of big changes, that happened in my trajectory before, moving from my PhD in one area, taking a job in another area, being on one track, and then switching to another track. So I'll pause there and see if people have questions either about the secondary teaching preparation that I focus on, or this kind of shifting of tracks.
I'll just say this. Oh, sorry, Liam. There's an interesting parallel here with the non-permanent, non-tenure track and what we have in England is we sometimes have, well, Liam, you're a teaching fellow, aren't you, currently?
Right.
So that's teaching focused lecturers who aren't expected to publish research.
Right.
Although I think now there's potentially a shift happening whereby a teaching fellow could be recognised as being the start of a teaching focused career track, and this is what TFun is all about. But actually, to be successful and progress along that track, publishing in some format that doesn't necessarily have to be, the top class rigorous journals, but important journals that have an impact in the field, that's certainly would be a hugely beneficial skill to develop. But
Yep.
I think there's potentially a bit of a lag in that teaching fellows don't have that time within their workload. They're full-time teaching. I don't know, Liam, do you want to come in now? Seeing
Yep.
as you've had
Yeah, that was not my question at all, actually.
Okay.
But it is. I can speak to it because I think it's a really interesting one. My question was more about this learners as teachers program thing that I was quite interested in when you were talking about it. But keeping on the subject Louise was talking about, I think there's that interesting thing where I think there's a lot more. So I'm someone who was on a research and teaching track with a heavy focus on the research for about 10 years. And then I had some career break opportunity in my life. And I personally made a decision that I like the teaching stuff. I think I maybe said earlier, I always wanted to do teaching. I'm going to do teaching. But it has been really interesting to figure out how you are an academic in a space where my instincts are always kind of still biased towards that research publication focus and what research as a teaching focused academic looks like. And yeah, I can see, I think I'd be interested to see where things go in the future, because it feels to me a lot more like I don't know other people's experiences. I'd really be interested to hear them, because I'm trying to figure a lot of this stuff out myself. But how much teaching has almost kind of started to take shape or take form as a genuine, like, legitimate career path within academia. I feel like I probably would have had, and this maybe speaks a bit to, you mentioned at the beginning, used the term, I was not well mentored at points. And I certainly feel I had mentors at the beginning of my academic career who were very much publish or perish, don't admit you like teaching, because you'll get more of it. And that kind of, okay, enjoy your teaching, but you're here to do research. And I don't know, I think I'm interested to hear what's gone on in the States as well, because I imagine it's probably a bit different all over as well.
No,
but yeah,
there's definitely, I mean, that's the message you get in an R1, which is just do the teaching because you have to. And the main thing that you should be focusing on is your research. At liberal arts colleges, we get a very mixed message, which is that they value research, teaching, and service in equal amounts, but they don't. They value research most. So it's really very confusing, for people to get that message that, oh yes, the three-stool, they call it, three-legged stool, but it's not. It's absolutely, if you don't publish, you're not going to get, reappointed or tenure if you're on a tenure line. Now, if you're on a teaching line, then that's not the expectation. So, we have the same kind of sort of complexity with the overlay of uncertain messaging, which isn't all that helpful. And I put, Liam, in the chat a couple of articles on that project that I mentioned, and I can share more if you want. But those were two of the earliest ones that I published. But Louise, you had a different question, or no? You already said yours.
No, I'm okay. No. Does anybody else want to come in?
Alison, could I just on the point? Sorry, I can't find my hands up icon. I've got a few icons missing, so I do apologize.
It's okay. Just jump in.
So I'm on a teaching focus track, and 11 years I was on a teach TNR, teaching and research, but in a post-92 university, which is just naturally more teaching focused. And now I've moved to a much more research intensive university, but on a teaching focused track, and been there in the last 7 years. And I think over this, just sort of reflecting back on the 7 years, it is really evolved, the teaching focused track. And I do think there is much, and I totally agree, Louise, that there is a growing shift towards more sort of research around the scholarly places. So there's social space, but also within your discipline. But sometimes it doesn't really translate time-wise, that we, the same amount of time or some time protected to do that. So, and also there are, where I work, there are different types of roles within teaching focus. I'm a director of student experience, so I probably do
less teaching compared to a teaching focused member of staff, but more focus on the student experience. So I think even within the teaching focus track, you're seeing that diversity within roles as well. So there is, the possibility to progress, and not necessarily into central management. So I still stay within my discipline, so which I like to do. So you can, so I think it is an interesting time, but I think the sort of, if you want to sort of progress, you're expected to publish, but yet I think we haven't got that space right about how can we protect time to do that.
That's right. I mean, it can't just be layered on top, of all of the teaching, which is, I think, what often happens at first, right? And that just is not sustainable, for people to really be doing two different jobs, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what it comes down to, is expecting you to be doing the work of two people on two different tracks.
Mm.
Yeah, no, it's. I agree with you that institutionally we have not figured this out.
Can I jump in and make an observation on that kind of teachers as researchers too? Because not the institution I'm at now, but the one I was at, I remember workload models are always very secretive things that, people don't want to share. But I remember the whole school at one point getting quite exercised about the fact that it became apparent that if you were on a research contract, you obviously had time in your contract for research, and you had time for teaching, and you had time for scholarship. And then my experience here is you have time for scholarship, which is basically research, but it's much less. So we have this problem that I think, Jagjit, you're kind of talking to, is like, well, we're still doing research, but we're doing it in a much more condensed period of our workload. But the institute I came from, I think our head of school had made a very clear decision that they wanted to be recognized as a school that cared about the pedagogy of teaching psychology and stuff. So actually it became apparent that all of our teaching focused staff on teaching focused contracts, and this is some years ago, so it may not still be the case, everyone had time in the workshop in their workload for scholarship. Research focused staff had time for their research, and teaching focused staff had time for pedagogical research, not quite as high as the research staff, but a significant chunk, to the point that people were kind of on the research side going, well, no, hang on, we need more, why are the teachers doing research? That's our job. And it got a bit contentious at one point.
Oh, I bet.
I bet.
Yeah.
But as you say, like, otherwise you're asking people to do things in time that, they can't do it.
It's not possible.
Yeah.
Not possible. Yeah. Hannah, did you have a point to this or something else?
No, just on a similar note, really, about that diversity within institutions, about what it means to be on a teaching focused pathway. So I used to be at a research intensive university, and there people who are on a teaching focused pathway had that allocation within their workload for scholarship. I'm now at a post-90T where there's a lot more focus on the teaching, but actually people who are on a teaching pathway don't have that time within their workload.
Right.
So yeah, it's just interesting how it doesn't seem as kind of standard as being on a researcher pathway within new universities. It seems to really differ across institutions whether or not you get that time and what the expectations are around that.
And I think that's partly because of the advent of the scholarship of teaching and learning, right? I mean, that's something that education faculty have been looking at forever, but now it's come to be recognized, amazingly, right, that everybody should be thinking about their teaching. Everybody should be researching to some extent what they're doing and why. So I think that really has complicated all of these tracks, because while the research track is typically research in the disciplines, right, there's also a proliferation of journals, focused on teaching in the disciplines, that people are starting to write for, as well as this sort of broader umbrella, more wider umbrella of the scholarship of teaching and learning. So I think the way the fields have shifted are also having an impact on how positions are defined and how expectations are articulated and how, people position themselves. And, to the point that's been a thread in this conversation to how you might move, how you might shift, your own position over time, depending on what institution you're in, what stage of your life you're at, what your, focus of exploration is. So there's so many more moving parts than just the clear, tracks for different people, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, it absolutely varies within institutions and over time. Definitely. Definitely. Well, maybe we can jump to the last slide and then, we can sort of think back over all of them and just open it up more generally. Louise, can you pop? Let's see, there it is. Okay, good. All right. So I developed that education program curriculum that I was telling you about before for about 10 years. I was in the role of director of that program and diversified it so that there were these minor pathways as well as the certification pathway. And then I was asked by our provost, so our dean of teaching and learning, to create some kind of space for faculty to reflect on their teaching. Because one of the illusions that faculty labor under at liberal arts colleges is that if they know their discipline, they know how to teach, right? Which is, I think, something that England does way better, in the UK overall does way better than we do, which is to expect people in higher education to have some kind of preparation and reflection on their teaching. But liberal arts colleges and no university in the United States is it required to have any kind of preparation to teach. And so many places now have teaching and learning centers. We still do not have a teaching and learning center, but I created what we call the Teaching and Learning Institute, it's more of a concept than a place. And it's sort of about making space for faculty to reflect on their teaching. And very specifically, I created the Students as Learners and Teachers, or SALT program, which is based on the program I already told you about, that's linking secondary students with college students preparing to teach. But this program links undergraduate students and faculty, academic teaching staff, in semester-long partnerships to reflect on the faculty members' teaching. So that program was sort of my way of insisting that students be part of the conversation about teaching and learning. And it's more in real time, right? Because for the secondary students, the people who are preparing to teach the secondary level, it's anticipatory, right? They haven't started teaching yet. But for the faculty at the college level, they are teaching. And so they're in these partnerships with undergraduate students, supporting their reflection on their teaching while they are teaching. So I've been running that program since 2006, where I co-created it with students and administrators and other faculty colleagues. And we've had more than 350 faculty participate, over 400 different partnerships. And my writing has, of course, shifted to focus on that as well. So, and especially since, now I'm on the tenure track, I'm actually at the top of the tenure line at this point. When you come in, you're an assistant professor, then you become an associate professor, and then you become a full professor. So I'm now a full professor on that tenure line, and my research program focuses on this, what I call pedagogical partnership work within my own courses and then across institutions. So I now consult, all over the world on this kind of work. So I've really taken something that was a focus from my practice as a secondary teacher and then as the director of a secondary teacher certification program and turned it into a model for a sort of an international approach to thinking about faculty development. So that's been exciting. But the key, the central theme of that work is the same, as what I had way back when I was a secondary teacher and moving into my role directing this certification program about how do we make sure the student voice is present? How do we foster dialogue, between teachers and learners so that that kind of reciprocal teaching and learning is happening all the time? So that's where I still am in my life. I'm still, at running that program. I'm still focusing in my teaching and in my writing on that. My courses, I didn't really include this as a strand of my courses, have also shifted the way I teach them from more traditional delivery model on my part to entirely co-created with students. I create structures for us to co-create what happens in the classes, which doesn't mean that I don't offer them any structure or guidelines. It means that they're very active in thinking about how they take those up. So that's my arc so far. I don't anticipate a giant change, but who knows? You know, I suspect I'll keep going, you know, sort of in this way that I currently am. But that was kind of the arc that I wanted to share with all of you. So maybe we can step back from that and we can actually stop sharing slides, Louise, if you think that makes sense, and we can just talk.
Okay. All right, thank you so much. And I'm just left feeling like wow, and how, yeah, I've got lots of questions about how, like on a really practical level, like how you engage students, and is it all of them or is it a subset of them? Maybe you could speak to that a bit on a more practical level, because I think we all probably feel like we want student involvement in terms of, you know, reflecting on how we teach and what we teach, but how, really in real practical terms, how do you go about doing that?
So for the form of the co-creation work that I do within my own courses, it's all the students. So all enrolled students are working sort of in partnership with me to co-create the course. So I give them things like, we have a course commitment form where I include in the form, and it's like a Word doc where there's fields that expand. So I include all the assignments for the course and an expandable field under each one. And I ask them to say, you know, how do you anticipate completing this assignment and what percentage of it do you want to count toward your grade within a certain range? Can't be like 100% this one. It can be 20, you know, to 40% like that. So they do that at the beginning, they do it in the middle, and they revisit it and see if they want to change, you know, what their percentages are. And then they do it at the end of the course and then self-assess based on what they've put in that course commitment form. And it's what I find is not, I mean, I have very clear structures in there. We have guidelines. There's a lot of work, but they have a lot of agency and choice in how they do that work and how much they want it to count for. Honestly, I don't think it changes a lot, you know, the percentages of what I would count it for, but it makes them feel very intentional and deliberate about what they're choosing, you know. So they'll, for instance, we have something that's also co-created called the co-created annotated bibliography, where we read some pieces in common, but then they also choose individual pieces that they do, and they contribute it to the annotated bibliography. Then they have this huge collection of resources. And at the beginning, some of them say, oh, this looks terrifying. I'm only going to have this count, you know, like 10% of my grade because I don't know how to do this and it really scares me. Then after they do it, they're like, oh, okay, now I get this. This isn't so scary. I want to do more of it, and I think I want to have it count more. You know, so one of the great things this does is opens up space for them to, you know, feel less vulnerable and take more risks. And then when they learn that they have capacity, or when they realize, actually, I thought I was going to spend a lot more energy on this, but I think I'm more excited about this other project now, then they can shift that around. So that's just an example of the way I do it within, and I have many, many more examples that I can share with you of structures that I've created to, by Alex, to support, you know, it's something they're very not used to, right? They are not used to doing this kind of co-creation. And I mean, you're in the UK, so you probably know Kathy Boville's work on co-creation. You know, she has done just incredible stuff, and she and I have worked together a lot on this work, and it's exciting to see how it's expanding now around the world. How many assignments? I would say there are 5, depending on how you count assignments. It's a lot, you know. So the first thing they have to do is, in the current course that I'm teaching, which is top of mind, they have to define co-creation. I'm actually teaching a course on co-creation. They have to have a conversation with an educator in which they write up a bunch of things like, you know, what's the context, what's the practice, what do you learn from it? They have to do a project where they design a co-creation kind of intervention. They have a final portfolio. So there's a lot of work in the course.
What time span is that done over? Sorry, is it like one semester?
It's a 15-week semester. Yeah, and we meet twice a week. And but of course they do a lot of the work outside of class.
Cool.
Yeah. Julie?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. I've been reading your work for ages, and I love the
Oh.
co-creation work that you do.
Thank you.
I just wanted to share a little bit of an insight from doing something a little bit similar here in the UK,
Oh,
but
great.
within our slightly different quality assurance structures.
Right.
So
Yes.
I've had students generate reading lists and co-create reading lists, and I've
Right.
done pretty much what you've just described,
Mm-hmm.
but done it in a way that it wasn't for credit. It
Okay.
was presented to them in a way that said, you know, it was part of my decolonizing work within
Right.
my department.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said to them, you know, I cannot teach all the different cultural perspectives,
Right.
all the different ways of thinking about this from different identities.
Right.
And I know that mainstream psychology is often very global north, very weird.
Absolutely.
And I would like to know whether you feel that this research that we're talking about in class sees you, represents you,
Nice.
is you, or whether
Yes.
there's a different way that we could be thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I got students to send me their extra readings, and it could be from their perspective as a trans person
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
as someone from a different international context. And
Yep.
they absolutely loved it
Yeah,
because,
of course.
you know, and they did it for no credit. They just, and I said, you can submit articles in any language.
Right.
But if you
Beautiful.
submit a non-English language article, then please make sure that you include just a paragraph that tells us what this paper says.
Right.
But it meant that they could really, you know, bring themselves into the curriculum.
Exactly. Exactly.
And they
Yeah.
felt that there, instead of, so something that somebody had been, a few people had been told on the course was, you know, you can't use articles that are not written in English because I can't read them and check that you're right. You know,
Yeah.
well, whose knowledge
Right.
is it anyway, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
You know, and you know,
That's great.
someone else was told, oh, you can't bring in research from a particular country because they don't follow our ethics systems.
Right.
And I was
Right.
like, no. Then it
No.
needs, you know, let's have that discussion about, you know,
Exactly.
the criticality of whether we, you know, what we think of particular types of research and why,
Exactly.
and you know,
Exactly.
let's decolonize that as well.
Right. Yeah,
But
that's
the
beautiful.
students absolutely loved it, and
Sure,
they
they felt
really got on
affirmed,
board.
they felt recognized. I mean, that's just great.
I had far more resources than I could use in the
Oh,
end.
right. Yeah,
But
but
what
they
I
can
did
use
each
them.
year was I put up last year's resources, and they could kind of add to them. And I mean, yeah,
Oh, great.
I moved universities. I don't know what would have happened if I'd carried on. I think it would have probably got unmanageable, but that needs some thinking as well. So maybe I needed a little student council to come and kind of,
Right. Yeah, that would be a great approach.
but
Yeah.
it really worked.
Yeah, that's a great example. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Who's next? I can see Liam's got a hand up.
Yeah, I just had a question. Like, I really love that idea, Julie. Having had some recent experiences with phantom AI references, and how would we deal with that in like, particularly when it was if it's in a foreign language, like, because that kind of checking the reference existing, which I'd never kind of,
So I wasn't doing it for credit. So who cares?
Yeah.
Really, you know, do I want to spend the very limited amount of time that I have policing my students?
No.
Or do I want to say to them, I trust you, you know, and actually if they're gonna, you know, they're going to upload an article, they're going to share a link, you know, the idea is not that they're doing it to, you know, give me something for their essay or their report or whatever, but it's for them to be able to express themselves and to share something with their peers. And if they don't submit anything, there's no consequences.
Yeah.
So why would the AI cheat it?
No.
They would. I mean, it was so it was in my last role. AI wasn't quite such a big thing.
Yeah.
But I don't think they would, because
it was more if it was used for credit, that then creeps in as a kind of, because I like the idea. I think I'd have a hard time arguing for any assessment to be added or formative assessment to be added unless it clearly linked into then there was something they were doing with all those readings in a subsequent assessment.
It. I mean, and that's what we do, with the annotated bibliography, is that they have to link it to course themes. They have to link it to what we've been talking about in class of one another. And I think they'd have a pretty hard time, you know, trying to put in enough information and parameters into AI, you know, to make that make sense. So I think that part of the answer is how do you contextualize it, within the work you're doing within the course that would be extremely hard to, again, to get AI to understand.
But I think as well,
Yeah.
where we saw the impact was actually through the module evaluations, you know,
Yeah.
because they were talking about the fact that, they learned from looking at each other's suggested readings.
Exactly.
And so they were saying, I had no idea that this was how people think in this other culture, or that family life doesn't look the same, or that,
Exactly.
that was fascinating to see, so they really did do a great job of peer tutoring.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that
and
also,
that in turn, I hope over time was helping them to take a more decolonial approach to the whole curriculum, because then, okay, so maybe I do more on my module about decolonizing, but one of my colleagues was likely to get those same students coming in and going, so does this generalize? Does this work
what about
in
this?
Cameroon?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really great. Have you written that up, Julie? Have you published that?
Yes, it's in a case study that
Can you put it in the chat?
The case study's out, but it's associated with a book chapter that isn't. I'll see if I can find the link and pop it in the chat.
Yeah, put it in the chat. I mean, there's obviously a lot of interest in that, so that'd be really helpful.
Go on, Jack.
But just on Julie's point, I think it's really interesting, and it's really made me think about one of my modules and another one that we have put in a module review in for around equity and diversity and inclusion for our second years. And what I was I forgot what I was going to say now. It was in my head. It's been a long weekend, and it's just around sort of the approach, some of the approaches around just getting students around the formative. There are ways that, sort of like we have some MCQs and we get students to write their own MCQs, and I'll choose one, but it's more about getting them to think about, the sort of the simple, the sort of conceptual ones and how we step up, and I really like the the sort of the skills that you've got, that you're getting them to look at their own life. There's another aspect of that where they're looking at the library, they're looking at books, they're looking, that searching aspect, in the first couple of weeks of university, that's so important. So I thought that would be really nice as maybe just as a activity we have a module on academic skills, just to, yeah, everything doesn't, there's so many little activities that we don't assess. But I thought that was a lovely idea, and it would fit quite nicely into some of the other things that what I do.
Yeah, Louise, were you going to jump in? I was just going to say, are there other kinds of things that all of this conversation is bringing up for people?
Well, I was going to just ask a kind of practical question, really. I wonder whether you could share a bit about your experience of writing a textbook in this, not a textbook, but writing a book on your work, and how that was, and whether that's something you would recommend, and what's the potential impact of writing a book versus writing journal articles. I wonder whether you could reflect a bit on that and how that has impacted, what effect that had, and how effective has it been, and what was it like doing that?
Well, yeah, sure. I'd be happy to talk about that. I mean, I actually have 10 books that I've written over the course of time, some on the first project I told you about, with the secondary students and the people preparing to be secondary teachers. And I don't teach that course anymore, the methods course, but they use the book, right, that I had written actually with some students about that. So that's one impact of writing a book, especially with students or with others who are involved in the work, is that it can become, a resource for other people who want to do similar kinds of work. The three of my most recent books have been on the program I just talked about, right? The Students as Learners and Teachers program, the SALT program, and that kind of co-creation and pedagogical partnership. And the benefit of that has been at least twofold, which one is I don't need to keep explaining over and over, what I'm doing, because people will contact me and ask me, oh, how do you do this? And so I really tried to sort of put it all into a book or two or three, you know, that would then other people, I could say, oh, take a look at this, and then we can talk about it, you know, after you've sort of read through, because of course every context is different and people want to talk about the particulars, which is great, but I didn't want to keep saying over and over again the really basic stuff. So that's a benefit. If you're doing a practice like what Julie's just described, you know, that you found really successful, you want to share it with other people. So maybe you could collect, Julie, you could do an edited volume, you know, of those kinds of practices, and then that could become reading for other people. So I think that's very helpful. The other thing that, I mean, and this is kind of obvious, but just to say it, is to publish these books, and then people, you become more visible, right? Otherwise, as teachers, we just do these practices in our classrooms and nobody knows that we're doing that. And people are doing it in different pockets around the world, but you don't know each other. And so by putting, you know, a book out there, and they're wonderful books, like one of the most recent, it's 2019 book that I co-authored with two students is open access online. You can download it right from the Elon University website. I'll put that in the chat also. And that's great because then to the equity issues, you know, of accessing some of these resources, I try very hard these days to put everything I can in that kind of format. Like I don't ask students to buy books anymore. Everything is accessible through links or through what I've put on reserve or books like this that are open access. So I think, you know, doing that, people can find you, they get the resources that they need, they can make connections across contexts around practices that would otherwise be invisible, you know, to people elsewhere.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyone else like to ask Alison anything? Just have maybe one more question, can I? Maybe then we'll round up here.
Sure.
Are there any particular like theories or theoretical approaches that underpin your work on the kind of students as partners model, or any other work that you've done in your kind of education career?
I would say the main influences are John Dewey, right? I mean, and really thinking about, and Dewey was, you know, one of the first to say that students should have a more active role in their learning, right? Way back, way ahead of his time. I don't think he practiced what he preached from what I gather, but the idea was good. Bell hooks is one of my absolute go-to people. Yeah, right, Julie, I'm not surprised that bell hooks resonates for you. In fact, my most recent book was dedicated to bell hooks. I mean, I wrote it while she was still alive, and she is truly visionary and did enact in her practice, you know, exactly what she was writing about. I've done some work at Berea College where she spent her final years, and I know she had a huge impact, you know, on that institution. So definitely bell hooks. I mean, overall, critical and feminist pedagogies are definitely linked. Sort of an influence on this kind of work. And more recently, you know, work in decolonizing the curriculum for sure. You know, works like L.A. Paperson, Eve Tuck, you know, folks who are doing really important work in thinking about desire-based research as opposed to damage-centered research. That's something Eve Tuck writes about that I think is very, very important, which goes to what Julie was talking about really recognizing that people have their worlds and their values and they're doing work that should be respected, not exploited, you know, which is what happens a lot of time with educational and other research. So I would say those are the main influences. Oh, good. Great. Okay, wait. Everybody grab this out of the chat because this is not Teams, and so the chat will not.
It'll disappear.
It will disappear. So grab it if you want things out of the chat.
Apologies. It's taken me a while to find it.
It's okay. You got it before we all left. So thank you for putting it in there. But those are the main ones, Louise, that come
Thank you.
come to mind. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I will just thank you so much again for your time, and it's been fascinating to get both an international perspective from what it's like in the States, also hearing some of the differences, but also parallels as well,
Yes.
and your work on, you know, really working with students as partners, and that's been really inspiring. And thank you so much for
Yeah,
talking
you can save the
about your
chat. It's
journey.
absolutely true, but it's not automatic. So you have to go and save the chat. But yeah, I agree, Louise. There's actually, I think there are more parallels than we might think. We just use different terminology, you know, in the UK and the US for some of our tracks and for some of our opportunities. But I do think I agree. There's a lot we can learn from one another. So yeah, thank you for having me. I
Thank you so
appreciate
much.
it.
Thank you. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks
Lovely to
everybody
see
for the
you
good
all.
conversation.
Okay, see you next time.
Take
All
care.
right, bye-bye,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.